Genocide and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. And thank all of our sponsors so much for your support, because we couldn't do programs like this without your assistance. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our museum members, our board members, our volunteers who are watching this evening. If you would like to learn more about membership or volunteer opportunities, please visit dhhrm.org. And we will leave time for questions and answers at the end of tonight's program. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions at any time during tonight's program. And I would also like to quickly introduce to you tonight's other presenter, who will be unmuting in just a moment. There we go. Felicia Williamson, who is our Director of Library and Archives. And Felicia, why don't you you'll pull up the PowerPoint and you start us off, and then we'll go back and forth as we go through tonight's discussion.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone. Tonight we're doing, for those of you who've come to our History Highlight series in the past, we sometimes bring in external archival resources and sometimes internal archival resources from our rich archival collection at the museum. But when Sara and I were discussing what we wanted to do for this program, we realized we hadn't taken the opportunity to take a deep dive in our oral history collection. And so that's what we're going to be doing tonight. But you'll quickly see by deep dive, we mean 3 out of 243 testimonies. So it's just skimming the surface, but we want to be sure to share with you what we have available and invite you to visit the museum, whether it's on our website or actually to the reading room at the Frank and Helen Risch Family Library and Archives to get a deeper understanding of the testimony collections that we have there. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to quickly help everyone understand what we have and how to access those materials. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about the oral history collection, both at the museum and available at the museum through the USC Shoah collection. Then Sara is going to do a historical overview of the Holocaust in Hungary and in Budapest, and you'll see that that is a complicated history. It's also one that in my academic background in the Holocaust is sometimes skipped over or glossed over, and it has some very worthwhile things to understand. And then we're going to use some clips from our oral history collection to dive deep. And so these are from our survivor community here in North Texas. They gave their testimonies, and we have some clips. I'm going to take a moment to give you a little caveat here. We did a lot of work to make the highest level quality and accessibility to the clips here over Zoom. Zoom sometimes cooperates, sometimes it gives a little lag. So we want to give a little notice here. If there's an AV and audio and video lag, please bear with us. It usually catches up to itself. So just bear with us there. We are aware of that. About 3 out of 4 times it's worked beautifully. 1 out of 4 times there's been a lag. So we know that. We've done a lot of testing and a lot of work to make that as good as it can be. And then we'll have our conclusion and have some Q&A time. So that's what's coming your way. Okay, next slide. So at the museum, at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we actually have a large library and archives collection that does include testimonies, both from our North Texas community that have been actually collected over a longitudinal time. So starting in the early 80s, even some predating the more well-known Spielberg Shoah Foundation collection. So, the community here took an active interest in retaining that important history and recording those testimonies starting in the early 80s. We have those testimonies and going all the way to the current day. We recorded testimonies of Holocaust and human rights survivors this year, and we continue to do that every year. So we have 200 I'm sorry, skipping ahead of myself. We have 3,500 library books. You can see that in our lovely reading room there. Over 20,000 artifacts. So those are documents and letters, photographs, and 3D objects. Then we have our oral history collection that we have collected here, but we also, through a wonderful donor, have full access to the Shoah Foundation database. And then any of that, if you have questions, want to get access to materials that you're not finding online, please just email archives@dhhrm.org and we'll help you with that. So next slide, and we'll get into the world history stuff. So when you're looking for the testimony collection that we have at the museum, the way to do that is to go to our homepage, and there's a research tab. So it's one of the top level tabs on the museum's homepage. And then when you go into that tab, there's an archives search tab, and that takes you to this homepage that you see snipped here on the right. And if you see, one of the pull-out collections is the oral history collection. So that will allow you to search inside our oral history collection. And then you can search all 243 testimonies that the museum's taken that are cataloged so far. We are adding to that every month. We add to that all the time. It's a priority for us. And just so you have a concept of that mix, we have 191 that are Holocaust related and 52 that are human and civil rights related. And again, we are still recording North Texas survivors that are Holocaust survivors. That surprises some people, but that is the case. And then we are recording human and civil rights modern genocide survivors too. And those are all viewable online, and there's full transcripts for all of those testimonies. Next slide, please. Then there's the full Shoah database. Now, the testimonies that the museum has recorded, you can view those online from your house. And any questions you have about those, please contact me. The Shoah database has an IP address restriction, which means you have to be on site at the museum to use that database. There are 56,000 plus testimonies available in the Shoah database, but again, you have to be on site at the museum to use that full accessible database. We're one of few full access database Shoah users here in North Texas, and in fact in the full region. And as you can see, that list of the kinds of testimonies and access, it's really a robust resource. To make an appointment, there is a form to fill out on our website, so we encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful resource. It does keywording, it's searchable. It's really worth your time to check it out. Okay, next slide. All right. I'm going to say 3 more sentences about oral histories before I hand it to our deep dive into Hungary and Budapest. So we get a lot of questions about oral histories in the library and archives, and Sara does too. I would say that they're some of the most robust and meaningful archival resources that we have in our collection. We sometimes think to ourselves, oh gosh, even when we conduct the interview, I wish I had asked that question, or I wish the person had said a little more there. There's always just a little sense of, gosh, I wish there was this, this, and this. And if you think to yourself about a family member, you might be thinking to yourself, I wish I had interviewed that family member. So I think what I wanted to say is, if there's someone in your community, if there's a family member that you've thought to yourself, I wonder what they have to say about an event in your local history or family history, we have iPhones that you could record a testimony with. But if you want to take it further, it's worth doing that next level and having videographer come and record a testimony. And if you want to contact the Historical Society to do even that next step, I think it's worthwhile, because what I'm struck with in hearing these testimonies and listening to these people talk about their experiences is how grateful I am that history was recorded. Okay, let's learn about Hungary and Budapest, because it is quite a journey.
Thank you, Felicia. This is going to be a blink and you miss it history of well, honestly, 1900 years of Hungarian history, I guess, but very light on the first part of this. So because we're dealing with Hungary, and particularly the Jewish population of Hungary, I wanted to give you the briefest of outlines about the Jewish presence in Hungary. And the first historical presence that we are aware of a Jewish population of any note, and it's very small, is in Hungary during the late Roman Empire. So it's under territory that was owned or captured by the Roman Imperium, and there was a small Jewish community there as part of the diaspora from Judea. So that's how far back a Jewish presence goes. Then in the later medieval period, so later medieval in contrast to the Roman period, but it's actually the early Middle Ages, 800-900 AD, the area of Hungary becomes Christianized. So again, it becomes Christian fairly early, and by Christianized we mean Catholic. It's not called Catholicism at the time because there's nothing to compare it to, but that is what they are. Fast forward to 1526, and Hungary before this has sat under a series of kings in the medieval period, a series of Hungarian kings. And in 1526, the Ottomans conquer Hungary. And from 1526 until 1686, so about 150 years, Hungary sits under the Ottomans. So it's very, very interesting. Although Hungary is Christian and remains Christian, Hungary was under Muslim rule for about 150 years. And there are Jews in Hungary, not large numbers, but there are Jews during this period. In 1686, the Austrians conquer Hungary as they begin to push back. I mean, they started earlier than this. They ultimately started by pushing the Ottomans back from the gates of Vienna, because that was how close the Ottomans came into what at the time was thought of as Christendom. So this is not just, these were two imperial forces fighting each other, the Ottoman Empire and what's going to become the Austrian and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there were also two religious groupings fighting each other for control, essentially, of this section of Central Europe. From 1686 until 1867, what we know today as Hungary sits under Austrian control. And it's an uneasy connection between the two areas. You know, Austria is German, it's Germanic in focus, it's German linguistically, it's focused toward the West. Hungary is in many ways much more Central European and somewhat focused eastward. Hungary also is Magyar, so the linguistic grouping that Hungary belongs to is not a Western European linguistic grouping. Hungarian is a fascinating language. It's linguistically related to Finnish and Finnish to it, but they're not related to any other languages in Europe. And the Austrian regime, when it takes over in 1686, liberalizes the treatment of Jews in some of the areas in the Austrian Empire that it controls. But they also impose fines upon the Jews at the same time. So they both milk the Jews for money, but then liberalize the conditions under which they can live. And they, later on in the 17th century, they issue edicts of toleration. So Jews are allowed to move around more freely within the area that's controlled there. Fast forward to 1848, and you have the outbreak of revolutions across Europe. These are the famous revolutions of 1848. You know, the Communist Manifesto is related to all of this, comes out the same year. And there is an effort on the part of Hungarians to break away from their Austrian controllers or imperial holders. It is a failed effort, but there is periodic flare-ups of Austrian attempts to kind of squelch Hungarian independence pushes or concerns. It's not as successful as you would have thought it would be. And by 1867, the two, Hungary and the Habsburg Austrian Empire, come to an understanding. They become what's called the dual monarchy. That is not to say that there aren't still Hungarian aspirations for independence, but this kind of puts a lid on them for a while. And the dual monarchy under the Habsburgs is in control in the area from 1867 to 1918. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire has a giant Jewish population. The two entities merged have a Jewish population of slightly more than 2 million across the empire. And the empire isn't Austria and Hungary, because that's how, when I used to teach this, my students would say, oh, well, that's small. It's not. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian Empire goes from Austria down along the Adriatic coast through what you would call what you would have called Yugoslavia up until 1989. So Bosnia-Herzegovina, those areas, Croatia, some territory of Serbia, and it goes all the way over. It goes through Czechoslovakia. So Czech lands or Czech and Slovak lands are part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it goes all the way over to Western Ukraine. So it is a very, very large Central European power, and it is a power that has a large Jewish population. And that Jewish population across the empire is extremely loyal to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, so to the Habsburg monarchy, to the Emperor Franz Joseph once we're into the early 20th century. One of the reasons the Jewish population is so loyal to the Habsburgs is because the Habsburgs represent a multi-ethnic, really in many ways multinational empire, and the only group in that empire who has nothing to fall back on if that empire should fall apart and all of these various ethnicities and nationalist groupings go their own way. There is no Jewish entity that exists here. And so it's added reason for the Jews to support the imperial experiment there. Heading into World War I, what you see is the rise of a pan-German movement. So these are German speakers within the Austro-Hungarian Empire who are pulling to join with their German speaking brethren. You have a pan-Slavic movement. So these are Slavic speakers who are looking toward potentially Russia and the East, and to move in that direction. And then you have other groups that are just agitating for liberation or freedom from Austro-Hungarian control. That comes fairly quickly when in 1918, with the end of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire implodes. And it isn't the only empire. Obviously, the German Empire implodes as well. The Russian Empire is gone. The Ottoman Empire is gone. So a whole series of empires go down as a result of the end of World War I. In the Hungarian instance, Hungary now emerges as an independent nation in 1918, 1919, and it emerges just in time to have tensions arise between forces of modernism and liberalism and forces of traditionalism and really more kind of religious focus. What this ends up resulting in is a brief few months of a more liberal style government in Hungary. followed by a communist revolution, which takes hold, particularly in Budapest, the capital of Hungary, and that communist revolution results in the socialist republic that emerges under Bela Kun, born Jewish but completely atheistic. Kun doesn't manage to hold on to power, and so this Soviet republic that is declared in Budapest lasts from about March 1919 to roughly the end of the year, and it collapses. At that point, what happens is that one of the nominal heroes of World War I for Austria-Hungary, a man named Miklos Horthy, who was an admiral during World War I, emerges as the leader of the Hungarian government. Horthy is an interesting figure. So he was an admiral during World War I, but Hungary, after the war, is a landlocked power, and yet that continues to be one of his titles. They don't have a navy at this point because they have no way of getting to water. Horthy also becomes the regent because the Habsburgs no longer hold power, the Habsburg monarchical family, and yet they exist. And there are Habsburgs, there are Hungarian Habsburgs to this day. They wield no power, but the family still exists. And so Horthy is declared regent because the regent means that he rules in place of the Habsburg, or technically on behalf of the Habsburgs, but that's not what he's doing. Horthy is a center-rightist in his politics. He's anti-Semitic, but remember that there's a big difference between being a European anti-Semite of this period and being a Hitlerian Jewish eliminationist, because that he clearly is not. So his anti-Semitic tendencies do not play out in the form of his ordering the murder of Jews, of his Jewish subjects. So I want to state that up front, because a lot of people have a tendency to conflate the two things. And what happens is that Horthy decides, as the 30s go on, that he is going to hitch his political wagon to the growing National Socialist presence in Central Europe, his neighbors, obviously, and that would be Nazi Germany. And so this picture that I used here, which I just love, is two very, very happy fascistic or fascistic-leaning authoritarians. I mean, frankly, Hitler tends more toward the dictatorial. Horthy tends more toward the authoritarian. I mean, he still has a parliament. He still has elements of his government that he cannot absolutely control. But as the 30s progressed, the two countries became closer and closer and closer in terms of their friendship. And by 1940, Hungary is actually going to enter the war as an ally of Germany. And that, on one level, is good for the Jews, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But in the interwar period, anti-Semitism becomes infinitely more prevalent in Hungary and, frankly, in the rest of Central Europe, particularly with the coming of worldwide depression and then the failure to dig out of depression as the 30s progress. And the way it plays out in Hungary as we come closer into the later 30s is with a series of laws in Hungary that limit Jewish participation in the economy, limit Jewish participation in professions, limit Jewish access to schools. By 1939, in Hungary, Jews are designated as a racial group, not a religious group. That's never a good sign. By 39, the Hungarian labor service system draft has been imposed. It was created originally for people, and by people I mean men of draft age, so men 18 and over, who weren't thought of as being particularly good material to be soldiers, so they would be drafted into labor brigades. But what very quickly happens is that it becomes the almost exclusive place where Jews are sent. And keep in mind that Jews fought on behalf of Austria-Hungary in World War I. They were decorated veterans, as they were in the case of the German Empire. And it's as if all of this is forgotten. And we'll come back to talk about the labor service in just a moment. By 40, they enter the war. Horthy makes the decision. They enter the war as allies of the Germans. And as part of this, as they begin to head toward the Western Front and the June 1941 Operation Barbarossa attack in the Soviet Union, the Hungarians are going to bring drafted labor brigade workers or forced laborers with them. Those are almost entirely Jews, and they're going to use them at the front to do some of the nastiest, dirtiest work because they're expendable. And by this, I mean they have them clearing minefields using sticks. You smack a stick in the earth, and when the mine goes off, whoops, we have one less forced laborer, but at least we know where that mine was. They have them with insufficient clothing, digging trenches. They have them working on pulling vehicles that get bogged down in the snow and the mud without any mechanical assistance. It's pure physical labor. I mean, this is rough stuff. And roughly 80% of the Jews who are drafted into the forced labor brigades and get shipped out to the Eastern Front never return. And remember, they're not being murdered in the Nazi killing machine or in the Holocaust by bullets in the East. They're being worked to death by their own fellow Hungarians. So keep that in mind. There's other things going on in Hungary. In 41, Hungary passes its own version of the Nuremberg codes, designating who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, forbidding any potential sexual relations, all of those kinds of things. But in spite of all of this, what you can say about Jewish life in Hungary, unless you're shipped into the labor brigades, is that life is uncomfortable, but fairly safe. By this, I mean, Jews are not being rounded up. Jews are not being ghettoized. Jews are not being shipped to concentration camps. Jews are not being shipped to death camps. They are limited in much of what they can do. At times, they have to deal with curfews. They have to be careful out on the streets. But by and large, they are, as I say, safe. And this is why I say that the allyship between Horthy and the Hungarians and Hitler and the Nazi Germans, in its own odd way, saves Jews. That's all going to change as the war progresses. So what happens is that the Germans begin to pressure Horthy to round up Jews. And while the Horthy regime in some of the extended areas outside of the post-war Hungarian territory, so Hungary has a much smaller territory that it is given out of the peace treaty that settles World War I. It loses about 60% of what was considered Hungarian territory under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Czechoslovak lands, including what are going to become Yugoslav lands. And part of the reason that Horthy is so willing to work with Hitler and his regime, in addition to the fact that they're both anti-Semitic, is that Hitler, as part of his grab of Czechoslovakia in 38 and 39, gives Horthy Czech territory that used to be Hungarian territory. They subsequently, the Nazis give the Hungarians Yugoslav territory that used to be Hungarian territory. In all of these areas, the Hungarians pick up land that they considered their own that they had lost, but there's something else, which is that they also pick up Jewish population, but they don't think of those Jews as being their Jews. And so those Jews, if you have to maltreat, if you have to ship out, if you have to placate your Nazi allies, that's where that's done. And Horthy, as the war progresses, starts to become more and more uncomfortable with his alliance with Hitler. Again, not particularly because of the Jewish issue, but because he sees the writing on the wall, and it becomes clearer and clearer to Horthy as we move into 1944 that there's no coming back from the losses that the Nazis have experienced, particularly at Stalingrad, and the devastating defeat that occurred there. And there were many Hungarian troops who fought there as well. So Hungary feels that very closely. Horthy then begins to make noises about wanting to sue for peace, possibly with the Soviets, possibly with the Allies. And it's a very involved process. I'm just glossing over it very quickly because of time. But what I can tell you is that as of March 19th, 1944, Hitler has had enough. And Hitler invades his erstwhile allies. And so the Nazis march into Hungary. Now, having said that, they do not depose Horthy. They leave Horthy in power, and they uneasily work together within Hungary. And the way you kind of begin to see this happen is in the series of anti-Jewish edicts that are issued. So March 19th, the Nazis enter Hungary and Budapest. I mean, they enter the entire nation. April 4th, they decree that all Jews henceforth will wear the yellow star. That's 3 weeks roughly after they come in. By May 15th, deportations begin all over Hungary, except in Budapest proper. And you need to know that between April 4th and May 15th, Jews everywhere in Hungary except Budapest were ghettoized. Now, again, the date, April 4th, May 15th, it's an incredibly close period of time. If you think back to how this worked in Germany, except for ghettoization, because they never ghettoized there, and if you think back to how this worked in Poland, it took the better part of a year and a half to begin to ghettoize. What you realize is that stuff happened incredibly rapidly in Hungary. You know, the Nazis have done this again and again and again. Now they know how to do this. They know how to do it quickly. And in fact, the ghettos in Hungary outside of Budapest proper exist for a few weeks to about a month. None of these ghettos are long-standing ghettos. They're basically catchment areas into which to pour the Hungarian Jewish population, which is about 725,000 Jews and another 100,000 who are also ghettoized and rounded up, who are Jews who had converted to Catholicism. That is the religion of the area. But the Nazis don't consider them Jews. And so it's a population of about 825,000. Between May 15th and July 8th or 9th, depending on whose counting you look at, more than 425,000 Hungarian Jews are deported from all of the areas of Hungary except Budapest, shipped to Auschwitz, and almost all of them are murdered upon arrival. They're gassed to death. To give you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of numbers, Auschwitz sees the death of about 1.1 million people. over the course of its operation as a death camp. Of those 1.1 million, about probably 980 to 990,000 of them are Jewish. 420,000 roughly of those who were murdered there are Hungarian, and that happens over the course of about 2.5 months. So half of all Jews almost who are murdered in Auschwitz are accounted for by those Jews who come from Hungary. It's that rapid. And the person who is sent in to supervise the rounding up and deportation of these Jews in Hungary is Adolf Eichmann. In addition to that going on June 21st of 1944, all Jews in Budapest are ordered to be resident in Yellow Star houses. This is a series of 1,900 to 2,000 houses spread around Budapest that are principally Jewish in population, and all Jews in Budapest are ordered to move into these houses. The Jews are wearing yellow stars themselves, and then the houses are painted with yellow stars. This isn't done anywhere else under Nazi occupation. Then on October 15th, Horthy is finally deposed. He's in active negotiations with the Allies, and the Nazis have had enough. They depose him, they take him under arrest back to Germany. Then in late November of 44, they finally ghettoize Budapest Jews. But if you're paying attention, by this time, the crematoria and the gas chambers at Auschwitz have been blown up. So there's no place to send those Jews who are forced into the ghetto. And you should also be asking yourselves, well, if Horthy is deposed, who is helping to rule Hungary? And that would be the Arrow Cross. And the Arrow Cross is a nasty, vicious, fascistic, anti-Semitic group that has been in the wings and jockeying for power with Horthy, and he's managed to keep them under control. But once he's gone, that's it, and they are in essence released. With their release comes a series of developments. First of all, they are responsible for shooting between 20 and 80,000 Jews into the Danube. They shoot them so that they fall into the Danube. These are Budapest Jews. They are responsible for marching thousands of Jews that they round up in Budapest out toward the west to the Austrian border, to concentration camps in Austria. Most of the Jews who are marched out to Austria during this time either don't survive the death marches, or if they survive the death marches, they die in concentration camps. And then at the end of November, as we said, of 44, they also open a ghetto in a very, very tiny former Jewish quarter of Budapest, and they shove 70,000 Jews into that area. And conditions for the Jews from then in Budapest until the end of the war, which is February 14th of 45, are extremely rough. What I would like to do now is talk briefly about Raoul Wallenberg and some of the other really heroic diplomats who are active in Hungary, and particularly in Budapest, to say that many Jews, thousands of Jews, owe their lives to Vatican safe passports, to Swedish safe passports, and to others who give them basically protection of their government and set up houses for them inside Budapest. Unfortunately, this can only do so much. And so Hungary ends the war starting with a population of 725,000 Jews, roughly, not counting that extra 100 of Catholic converts. It ends the war with around 200 to 220,000 Jews. The rest of those Jews, so about 500,000 Jews, are murdered over the course of the war. And now what I'd like to do is go to the testimonies that are going to elaborate upon some of this. So First testimony was given by Tibor Grunberger, and this is a small history of Tibor. He was Czech, was smuggled 3 times into from Czechoslovakia into Hungary, caught several times and shipped back, but ultimately ended the war in Hungary. In his life, he loses his father during Czech transports earlier in the war. These are transports that begin in 42. His mother survives the war. He and his brother survive the war. Ultimately, they are going to move to Israel and then to the United States. And this is his testimony talking about the last time he sees his father being taken onto a transport in Czechoslovakia, and the first time he gets thrown out of Austria when he sneaked across the border. Could we play that?
I'm just going to say real quick that his story illustrates something that we see, 2 things that we see quite a bit. One being that Hungary's history, as you just saw from Sarah's overview, incorporates the ever-changing state of borders. You see in an individual's history that they might live in one area that changes statehood 4 or 5 times in the course of their own adolescence even. And then of course that the other thing we see in our archival collections and in the testimonies is that families were faced with an impossible series of decisions. Which direction do you flee? Who do you trust with your children? You see that in testimony time and time again, and then you see parents making impossible choices. And the 3 testimonies we chose interact with their families and with the situations they're encountering, but also with their environment and their children. And then they're navigating this as children, but of course they grow up instantaneously in a lot of ways, but they are still children. So that's just a little caveat that is somewhat hard to remember sometimes. So I just wanted to throw that out there, but let's watch it.
Thanks, Felicia.
That's when they took my father. And that's the last time I saw him. I was 11 years old. I went out to the railroad station. And his brother, my uncle, I never forget, my father is already inside the railroad car. And he lifts me up and he says to me, "Say goodbye to your father." I was 11 and that's the last time I saw him. So that's the last time I saw him. The first time we got to Budapest, we were there only at my uncle's, no more than about 2 months, 2 to 3 months. And at that time in Hungary, it was against the law to hold children who were not Hungarians. It was against the law. And my uncle had a wholesale bicycle. It was a big store. The bookkeeper turned us in. They took us to the Slovak-Hungarian border. In other words, they wanted to get rid of us, which they did, by the way. And that one night I'll never forget as long as I live. It was around midnight or so when we finally arrived, I don't remember the little town where it was, the border town. It was between Hungary and Slovakia, you see. The Hungarians had, there were a group, their entire, the police, they called them well, they were really sadists. So he says to me, naturally in Hungarian, he says to me, he says, do you see this? Do you see this big forest here? He says, see, this way is Slovakia. And he says, you start walking. And he says to me, and by the way, just in case you get kind of turned around and you happen to come back to Hungary tonight, he says, I'll shoot you like a dog. These are his exact words. I'll shoot you like a dog.
Could we have the next slide, please?
That's when they...
Okay, so this testimony is a brief section from a testimony that's more than 4.5 hours long that was given to us by Dr. Zsuzsanna Auschwitz, who founded the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas, Dallas. And she talks about some of her experiences, but particularly what she's focusing upon is the rapidity with which the Jewish population in Hungary moved from being nominally free to March 19th, 1944, and the invasion of the Nazis, to being ghettoized, transported, deported, all of these things as well.
And before we start this one, I wanted to mention she really does, in some of her testimony, mention or discuss something that hit some of the interviewees hard, which was the journey from being quite assimilated and then having increasing encroachments onto their lives, then going all the way to being, attacked and even put into these situations. And then, like Sara mentioned, many of their families had been decorated and even venerated. And so it was a juxtaposition. Okay.
Yeah.
So we boarded the Yellow Star on the 5th of April. By the 1st of May in Hungary, all over the country except in Budapest, the Jews were ghettoized. I mean, this is a quite interesting result. You don't see that anywhere. That happens, of course, they had a big practice by then. But so within 15 days, not quite, yeah, 19th, March 19th, April 5th. It's about 15, 16 days. And for the ghettoization, even much longer. No, I mean, this went like that. 2 weeks, the Yellow Star. 1 month, the beginning of the deportation, or the ghettoization, By the 15th of May, ghettoization is finished, so you have now 2 months, and on the 15th of May, deportation to Auschwitz starts. 2 trains of all 140-some trains, don't go to Auschwitz, they go to Austria. Many of those people survive. virtually everybody who goes to Auschwitz, I don't know, 4% perhaps stays alive, the rest is killed. And that happens, that is finished. The deportation to Auschwitz is finished by the 1st of July. And then it's planned that Budapest will be deported. Now, the Budapest Jews were, like the rest of the country's Jews, they were ghettoized. You know what ghettoization means. I mean, we were incredibly lucky, knock on wood, here it is, and the house where we lived became a ghetto house, because whether or not a house became a ghetto house was dependent on whether you have 60% more Jews living there or not. And in our house, 60% Jews were living.
Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the third of the testimonies and the final one that we're going to share with you this evening. This is the story of somebody who was born and raised in Budapest and was 8 when the Nazis arrived. And so he talks about some of his experiences in that period of a few months when the Nazis were there. The one thing I would add to this to flesh out what Felicia was just saying before Juji spoke is that the other thing to keep in mind about assimilation is that roughly half of the country's Jews in Hungary were resident in Budapest, and half of them were resident in villages, towns, and the countryside. The half who were resident in Budapest were not entirely, but they were in the main assimilated Jews. So very modernized, very light in terms of their religious practice. Virtually the entire population of Hungary outside of Budapest was a much more traditional, what today you would call Orthodox in their religious practice group of Jews. So the very fact that the deportations mostly occurred in the outside Budapest means that the Jewish population of Hungary that was wiped out almost entirely was their religiously Jewish population. It's a really devastating thing when you think about it. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the stories we're hearing, we're only able to hear because they survived.
Yeah. Yep. Could we play Andres's testimony, please?
Now, the most dramatic thing that happened that brought home to me the full impact of the Holocaust as far as it went for us, that my mother, because she was under 40 years of age, was ordered to go to a place when they were getting ready to take people to the concentration camp like Auschwitz. And that morning, I remember very well, I knew that my mother was going to be taken away, and I don't know if I ever see her again. Now, I'm going to go beyond answering the question you asked, just to say that my mother, having a lot of nerve, which they call chutzpah in Yiddish, I guess, she was very fortunate also, because it got dark and she was told that they were done for the day, but she had to go back the next day. And this was in a soccer stadium in Budapest. Instead of going back, she took a little shopping bag, put a couple of pieces of silver in there, took the yellow star off my coat as well as hers, and we took off. And she was going to see if she can go into hiding, which she eventually did. But there's another part of that story. If you're going to ask me about it, I'll tell you. But at least I wanted to bring that to the conclusion that my mother, thank God, was not taken away, because she got fortunate, and then she had the nerve actually not to give in, but actually look for other alternatives. So I was taken to a Red Cross by somebody else, that was again another gathering place for people being taken to the ghetto. And that was another way of concentrating Jews before they somehow find a way of killing them. And I was basically left on my own when I was 8 years old. Even though I met my grandparents at this Red Cross place, but I didn't stay with them. And I was just hanging around waiting to see what happens.
What did you do? How long were you on your own?
Well, again, somebody somewhere was looking out for me. And I developed a disease which is highly contagious called scarlet fever. And then I was separated from everybody else along with 2 other teenagers. I mean, I was not a teenager yet, I was only 8 years old. But these other 2 kids were teenagers. And we were put into a separate room. So when the Hungarian fascists came to get everybody lined up and get ready to go to the ghetto, they just barely opened the door, but they wouldn't even want to come in because they knew we had a contagious disease. So instead of being taken to the ghetto, I eventually was taken to a military hospital where I was put together with soldiers who were being treated very well, and so was I. At that point, I was not discriminated against as a Jew. I was just being treated as a patient with a contagious disease who had to be isolated.
That, I think you're still muted. That's our final clip, and we are almost out of time. A couple of things stuck with me from the 3 of them, which is how, you know, in the museum exhibits, there's these through lines of upstanders and bystanders and perpetrators, and you see that there's individuals that impacted each of these individuals, and you know, Erji saves Juji and her family not once, I don't even know how many times, multiple times, over and over, at great personal risk. Then I don't know the name of the person, the employee or something that turns in Tibor's family, the secretary, I think. So, you know, that kind of thing is unfortunately a story we hear quite often. And then it seems somehow cruel, but a lot of these stories have, whether you call it fate or luck or just happenstance, where just turning left rather than right, ending up catching a very scary childhood disease and ending up in a hospital where the doctors and nurses take care of him just because he needs to be taken care of. It didn't have to go that way, and it did. And so he survived. And we hear stories like that.
I was going to add to that Juji's Erji, because Erji is with the family. The Abonyi is the name, is her Abonyi is her
family
maiden name. And
Yeah.
she's with the Abonyi family from the time she is 12 or 13 until well into her 20s. And she is put forward by Juji and her brother to be recognized as righteous among the nations on the basis of their testimony for what she did for the family during the war. And in fact, she is honored with a tree at Yad Vashem. She has been awarded that status. We're almost out of time. I wanted to just get to Ricardo Cruz's question. Ricardo, this is actually a really, really good question. His question is, do we know if there were any tensions among the converts to Christianity and those who refused to convert? Also, do we know how many of the converts went back to Judaism post-war? And it's a great question because it's also indicative sometimes of how people who are Christian think about Jews who convert. Because Ricardo, the word that you choose is those who refuse to convert. The Jews who converted to Christianity, to Catholicism, didn't convert because they were forced to convert. These are people who converted years before the war. They didn't convert because Hitler was on their borders. They converted because they lived in a largely Catholic country and for a whole series of personal reasons felt drawn to Catholicism. As for tensions between these Catholics and their former families, I would imagine the tensions were probably fairly high, as there are between any family and a family member who chooses a religion that is different from the path the family has chosen. So in answer to the second part of this, how many converts went back to Judaism post-war? In fact, those who chose Catholicism stuck with it. But the other thing that I do know for a fact is that there were a number of Jews from Budapest who survived the war, who after the war became Catholic, because they saw that as the route to a more normal and safer existence.
But then both groups of people encountered a whole lot of other challenges when communism came. As far as their religious practice, Jews may be more than Catholics, but when communism came, there was a whole other set of challenges for religious practice.
Okay, I think that is all the time we have. I hope this was as interesting to you all as it was to us doing the research, because this is something that we were aware of the outlines of, but hadn't considered in depth. And there is so much more to learn about this particular element of the Holocaust. So I would strongly suggest to anybody who's interested to look for books and go through that way, because there is a lot of information out there on Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then subsequently in Hungary during the war. And it's really, really fascinating. So thank you so much.
If you do want to just read the articles on United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Holocaust in Hungary, that's great. And if you want to visit our website and research tab, please do that as well.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.